The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. At 24 years old, he had been serving as a royal guard for 3 years, and every day still felt like an honor beyond his wildest childhood dreams. The weight of his bearskin hat, the gleam of his polished buttons, and the precision of his movements were all second nature now, but the pride never faded. James had grown up in a small town outside London, where his grandfather had filled his young mind with stories of military service and duty to country. His grandfather, William Mitchell, had served in World War II and later in Korea, returning home with medals he rarely spoke about and memories that sometimes haunted his quiet moments. It was those stories, told with a mixture of pride and melancholy, that first planted the seed of service in James's heart. The path to becoming a royal guard had not been easy. The selection process was grueling, demanding not just physical fitness but mental fortitude, unwavering dedication, and an almost supernatural ability to remain motionless for hours while maintaining perfect posture. James had endured months of training at the Infantry Training Center, learning drill movements with mathematical precision, studying protocol until it became instinct, and developing the stone-faced composure that tourists from around the world came to witness. His family had been incredulous when he first announced his intention to join the Guards. His mother, Sarah, had worried about the demands of military life, while his father, Robert, had quietly expressed pride mixed with concern about the challenges his son would face. His younger sister, Emma, had simply been excited about the prospect of seeing her brother in his ceremonial uniform. The training had been transformative. James learned that being a royal guard was about far more than standing motionless outside royal residences. The guards were active military personnel, trained for combat and ceremonial duties alike. They learned about the history of their regiment, the significance of their role in protecting the royal family, and the weight of representing centuries of military tradition. During his training, James had struggled most with the mental aspect of the job. Standing perfectly still for 2 hours while tourists took photographs, asked questions, and sometimes tried to provoke reactions required a level of mental discipline he had never needed before. His drill sergeant, a gruff man named Sergeant Major Thompson who had served for over 20 years, taught him techniques for maintaining focus and handling the psychological challenges of the role. The uniform you wear, Sergeant Major Thompson had explained during one particularly difficult training session, represents every man who wore it before you. You're not just James Mitchell when you put on that red tunic. You're carrying the honor of every guard who stood watch before you, and you're setting the standard for every guard who will follow. Those words had become a mantra for James. Every morning as he dressed, he thought about the weight of tradition he carried. The red tunic was not just clothing, it was a symbol of dedication, courage, and unwavering service. The bearskin hat was not just headgear, it was a crown of responsibility that connected him to generations of soldiers who had protected the realm. On this particular morning, James was assigned to Windsor Castle, one of the most prestigious postings a guard could receive. The ancient castle walls held centuries of royal history, and standing guard there meant being part of a living tradition that stretched back through countless generations. As he walked through the guardroom, checking his equipment one final time, James felt the familiar surge of purpose that accompanied the start of each shift. The other guards nodded respectfully as he passed. There was Marcus, a veteran guard with 5 years of service who had become something of a mentor to James. Marcus had seen it all during his time in service: state visits from world leaders, royal weddings, and the daily rhythm of protecting one of the world's most famous families. He had taught James the unwritten rules of guard duty, the subtle ways to handle difficult tourists, and the importance of maintaining dignity even in challenging circumstances. Then, there was David, barely 21 and in his first year of service. David reminded James of himself when he had first started, eager but nervous, determined to prove himself worthy of the uniform he wore. James had taken David under his wing the way Marcus had done for him, understanding that the traditions of the guards were passed down not just through formal training but through the bonds between the men who served together. As James took his position outside the castle entrance, the morning routine began. The changing of the guard was a precisely choreographed ceremony that tourists gathered to witness every day. Each movement had meaning, each step had purpose, and each gesture represented hundreds of years of military tradition. James felt his muscles tense in the familiar pattern as he prepared for the ceremony. The tourists began gathering early, cameras ready, guidebooks in hand, children pointing excitedly at the guards in their magnificent uniforms. James had learned to appreciate the wonder in their faces while maintaining his professional composure. He understood that for many of these visitors, seeing the royal guards was the highlight of their trip to London, a chance to witness a piece of living history. During his breaks, James often reflected on how his grandfather would have reacted to seeing him in uniform. William Mitchell had passed away 2 years before James joined the Guards, but James carried his memory with him every day. He imagined his grandfather's pride, the way his old eyes might have brightened at seeing his grandson carrying on a tradition of service. The morning passed in the usual rhythm of guard duty. James stood at attention, his mind alert but his body perfectly still, trained to notice everything while appearing to notice nothing. He watched the flow of tourists, the movement of staff within the castle grounds, and the subtle signs that indicated the routine was proceeding normally. It was during moments like these that James felt most connected to his purpose. He was not just a tourist attraction or a living statue. He was a protector, a guardian of tradition, and a representative of something larger than himself. The uniform he wore connected him to countless men who had served before him, and his service would, in turn, inspire those who came after. As the morning wore on, James noticed an elderly man approaching the castle entrance. The man moved slowly, using a walking stick for support, but there was something in his bearing that caught James's attention. Despite his obvious physical limitations, the man carried himself with a dignity that spoke of military training. His clothes were neat and pressed, his hair was carefully combed, and his eyes held the alert awareness of someone accustomed to observing his surroundings. The elderly man paused near the entrance, studying the guards with an expression that seemed to hold recognition and respect. James maintained his professional composure, but something about the man stirred a memory of his grandfather, the same bearing, the same quiet dignity that marked a man who had served his country with honor. The man appeared to be alone, which struck James as somewhat unusual given his apparent age and mobility challenges. Most elderly visitors came with family members or tour groups, but this man seemed to be making his visit independently, driven by some personal motivation that had brought him to the castle grounds. As James continued his duty, he found his attention occasionally drawn back to the elderly visitor. There was something about the man that seemed familiar, not in the sense of personal recognition, but in the way that one service member recognizes another. It was a quality that transcended words or obvious signs, a bearing that spoke of shared experiences and common values. Harold Thompson had risen before dawn, as had been his habit for more than 60 years. At 83, his body protested the early hour more than it once had, but his mind remained sharp and his sense of purpose unwavering. Today was special, though he had not shared the significance with anyone. Today marked the 60th anniversary of the day he had first reported for duty as a young soldier, beginning a military career that would span 3 decades and take him across the world. The decision to visit Windsor Castle had not been made lightly. Harold lived alone in a modest flat in East London, having lost his wife Margaret 2 years earlier after 55 years of marriage. Their children lived in other cities, busy with careers and families of their own, and, while they called regularly and visited when they could, Harold had become accustomed to his own company. Margaret had always been the one to remember anniversaries and mark special occasions. She had kept photo albums filled with pictures from his military service, had framed his medals and displayed them proudly in their sitting room, and had insisted on attending veterans' events even when Harold himself preferred to let such things pass quietly. Without her gentle insistence, Harold had found himself retreating from social connections, spending his days reading military histories and watching documentaries about conflicts he had lived through. But this morning felt different. As Harold had sat with his morning tea, looking at the photograph of himself in uniform that Margaret had kept on the mantelpiece, he felt compelled to do something to mark the day. The idea of visiting Windsor Castle had come to him suddenly, inspired by memories of a visit he and Margaret had made there 15 years earlier. During that visit, Margaret had been fascinated by the guards, asking Harold endless questions about their training, their duties, and how their role compared to his own military service. Harold had found himself studying the young men in their magnificent uniforms, seeing echoes of his own youth in their bearing and dedication. Margaret had insisted they stay for the changing of the guard ceremony, and Harold had been moved by the precision and pageantry, even though he would never have admitted it at the time. preparing for today's journey had required careful planning. Harold's mobility had declined significantly since Margaret's death, not just due to his advancing age but because of old injuries that had never properly healed. A piece of shrapnel in his left leg, a souvenir from his service in Northern Ireland, had become increasingly troublesome in recent years. His doctor had suggested a walking stick, which Harold had initially resisted but eventually accepted as necessary. The journey to Windsor required taking 2 buses, a trip that would have been simple in his younger days but now presented multiple challenges. Harold had to plan his route carefully, ensuring he knew where the bus stops were located and how much walking would be required between connections. He packed a small bag with his medications, a bottle of water, and a sandwich Margaret would have insisted he bring. As Harold made his way through London that morning, he reflected on the changes he had witnessed in his lifetime. The city bore little resemblance to the London of his youth, when he had first enlisted in the army. In 1963, Harold had been an 18-year-old with few prospects, growing up in a working-class family where military service was seen as both an honor and an opportunity. His father, George Thompson, had served in World War I and had filled Harold's childhood with stories of camaraderie, duty, and the brotherhood found among soldiers. Unlike some veterans who never spoke of their service, George had believed in sharing both the glory and the hardships of military life. He had taught Harold that service to country was one of the highest callings a man could answer, but he had also been honest about the costs that service could exact. Harold's military career had taken him to conflicts that most civilians preferred not to think about. He had served in Northern Ireland during some of the darkest years of the Troubles, had been stationed in various bases across Europe during the Cold War, and had participated in peacekeeping missions that rarely made headlines but were essential to maintaining stability in troubled regions. The memories of his service were complicated. There had been moments of intense pride, times when Harold had felt truly part of something larger than himself, contributing to causes that mattered. The bonds he had formed with fellow soldiers were unlike any relationships he had experienced before or since. These men had shared dangers, hardships, and triumphs that created connections deeper than friendship. But there had also been difficult times. Harold had seen things that still haunted his dreams, had made decisions that continued to weigh on his conscience, and had lost friends whose faces remained vivid in his memory decades later. The transition to civilian life had not been easy, and it was Margaret's patience and understanding that had helped him find his place in a world that often seemed to have little use for the skills and experiences he had gained in the military. During the bus journey to Windsor, Harold watched the countryside pass by and thought about the young men and women currently serving in the military. He wondered if they faced the same challenges he had encountered, whether the bonds of service remained as strong as they had been in his day, and how well society was preparing them for eventual return to civilian life. The physical challenges of the journey became apparent as Harold transferred between buses. What had once been simple movements now required careful planning and considerable effort. His walking stick, which he had initially seen as a symbol of weakness, had become an essential tool that enabled his independence. Without it, this journey would have been impossible. When Harold finally arrived at Windsor, he was struck by how much the area had changed since his last visit with Margaret. The town was more commercialized, with additional shops and restaurants catering to the constant stream of tourists. The castle itself remained magnificent, its ancient walls a testament to centuries of royal history, but the surrounding area bore little resemblance to his memories. The walk from the bus stop to the castle entrance was longer and more difficult than Harold had anticipated. His left leg, weakened by the old injury and stiffened by arthritis, began to protest the uneven pavement and the gradual incline toward the castle gates. Several times he had to stop and rest, leaning heavily on his walking stick while catching his breath. Other tourists passed him during these rest stops, some glancing at him with mild curiosity, others seeming not to notice him at all. Harold did not mind the lack of attention. He had never sought recognition for his service and was not about to start now. But he did notice the contrast between his current limitations and the vitality of the younger tourists around him, a reminder of how much his body had changed over the decades. As Harold approached the castle entrance, he could see the royal guards in their ceremonial positions. Even from a distance, their bearing impressed him. The precision of their posture, the immaculate condition of their uniforms, and the sense of purpose they projected reminded him of his own days in service, when such standards had been not just expectations but sources of personal pride. The sight of the guards stirred emotions Harold had not expected. He found himself remembering the feeling of putting on his own uniform for the first time, the weight of responsibility that came with representing something larger than himself, and the pride he had felt in meeting the standards expected of a soldier. These young men, standing guard at one of the most important royal residences, were carrying on traditions that connected them to generations of military service. Harold's progress toward the castle entrance continued to slow. The combination of physical fatigue, emotional reflection, and the simple logistics of navigating the tourist area with his walking stick made each step more difficult than the last. He began to worry that he had overestimated his physical capabilities in planning this journey. But the significance of the day continued to drive him forward. This was not just a tourist visit, it was a pilgrimage of sorts, a way of honoring both his own service and the continuing tradition of military dedication represented by the guards. Harold was determined to complete his journey, to pay his respects to these young men who were carrying forward the legacy of service he had once been part of. As he drew closer to the guards, Harold felt a familiar stirring of respect and recognition. These were his people, in a sense, men who had chosen to dedicate themselves to something larger than their individual concerns. The differences in their ages, their specific roles, and the eras of their service mattered less than the common thread of dedication that connected them across time. James had been at his post for nearly an hour when he noticed the elderly man's struggle becoming more pronounced. What had initially appeared to be the normal slow pace of an older tourist was clearly something more serious. The man was now stopping every few steps, leaning heavily on his walking stick, and James could see the strain etched across his weathered features. The training of a royal guard included learning to assess situations while maintaining ceremonial composure. James had been taught to recognize potential security threats, medical emergencies, and unusual circumstances that might require breaking protocol. His instructors had emphasized that while maintaining tradition was important, human safety always took precedence over ceremonial requirements. As Harold Thompson struggled up the slight incline toward the castle entrance, James found himself in an internal conflict. Protocol dictated that he remain at his post, maintaining the stoic composure that tourists expected. Royal guards were not supposed to acknowledge individuals in the crowd, respond to attempts at conversation, or break character unless absolutely necessary. The mystique and dignity of the position depended on this unwavering professionalism. But James's grandfather's voice seemed to echo in his memory, reminding him about the importance of helping fellow service members. William Mitchell had often spoken about the unwritten code among military personnel, the understanding that those who had served their country deserved respect and assistance from those currently serving. It was not just about regulations or official policies, it was about honor and human decency. Harold's condition continued to deteriorate as he attempted to navigate the last 50 yards to the castle entrance. His breathing had become labored, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and his grip on his walking stick had tightened until his knuckles were white. Several tourists had noticed his struggle, but none seemed inclined to offer assistance, perhaps assuming that someone else would help or uncertain about how to approach an elderly stranger who might be proud and independent. James watched as Harold paused again, this time for longer than before. The elderly man's legs seemed to be shaking with the effort of supporting his weight, and James could see him looking toward the castle entrance with a mixture of determination and despair. It was clear that Harold was committed to reaching his destination, but equally clear that his physical condition was making the goal increasingly difficult to achieve. The moment that changed everything came when Harold attempted to take another step forward. His left leg, weakened by decades of wear and old injuries, simply gave out beneath him. James watched in alarm as the elderly man began to fall, his walking stick clattering to the ground as he lost his balance. Time seemed to slow as James faced the most important decision of his military career. He could maintain his post, following protocol and hoping that bystanders would assist the fallen man. Or he could break the sacred composure of his position, abandoning centuries of tradition to help someone who clearly needed assistance. The image of his grandfather flashed through James's mind, along with every lesson about duty, honor, and the responsibility of those in uniform to protect and serve. But, more than any abstract concept of duty, James felt a deeply personal recognition that the man now struggling on the ground was someone who had once worn his own nation's uniform with pride. Without further hesitation, James broke his ceremonial stance. The movement felt shocking after the rigid immobility of his guard duty. His legs, trained to remain perfectly still for hours, suddenly carried him forward with purpose. The weight of his bearskin hat, the restriction of his tight red tunic, and the formality of his ceremonial sword seemed insignificant compared to the urgency of the moment. James reached Harold just as the elderly man hit the ground. Training from his basic military education kicked in as he quickly assessed the situation. Harold was conscious but clearly in distress, his breathing rapid and shallow, his face pale with exertion and possibly pain from the fall. "Sir, are you all right?" James asked, his voice gentle despite his concern. He kept his tone respectful, recognizing instinctively that this was a man who deserved dignity even in his moment of vulnerability. Harold looked up at the young guard with surprise and gratitude. "I'm fine, lad," he said, though his shaky voice contradicted his words. "Just need a moment to catch my breath." James knelt beside Harold, his ceremonial uniform now secondary to the human need before him. "Take your time, sir. There's no rush." He retrieved Harold's walking stick and placed it within easy reach, then positioned himself to provide support if Harold needed help getting back to his feet. Other tourists had begun to notice the situation, some stopping to watch while others continued past as if nothing had happened. James was dimly aware of people taking photographs, probably surprised to see a royal guard breaking character, but he focused entirely on Harold's well-being. "Been a soldier, have you?" Harold asked after a few moments, his breathing beginning to stabilize. James nodded. "Yes, sir. Royal Guards are active military personnel." "I can tell," Harold said with a slight smile. "It's in the way you carry yourself, even when you're not standing guard." "I did 30 years myself, Army." The connection James had sensed earlier suddenly made perfect sense. This was not just an elderly tourist in distress, this was a veteran, a man who had dedicated decades of his life to serving his country. The respect James felt for Harold deepened immediately, tinged now with the recognition that he was helping someone who had once stood where James stood now, serving with dedication and honor. 30 years is impressive service, sir," James said with genuine admiration. "What was your unit?" Harold's eyes brightened slightly at the question. "Started with the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, then transferred around a bit. Did tours in Northern Ireland, Cyprus, a few other places you probably haven't heard of." James felt a surge of respect for the man before him. Northern Ireland during the Troubles had been one of the most dangerous assignments a British soldier could receive. The fact that Harold had served there, and continued serving for decades afterward, marked him as someone who had faced genuine danger in service of his country. "That's serious service, sir," James said. "Thank you for your dedication." Harold waved off the thanks with a gesture that spoke of lifelong modesty about his military service. "Just did my job, same as you're doing now. Though I have to say, I never had a uniform quite as magnificent as yours." The conversation was helping Harold recover his composure, but James could see that the elderly man was still struggling with the physical demands of his situation. Getting back to his feet was going to be difficult, and completing his journey to the castle entrance might be beyond his current capabilities. James found himself facing another decision. He could help Harold to his feet and return to his post, letting the veteran continue his journey at his own pace. Or he could go further, offering more substantial assistance that would require him to abandon his duties for an extended period. The answer came to James with surprising clarity. This was not just about helping a tourist or even assisting someone in medical distress. This was about honoring the service of a man who had earned respect through decades of dedication to the same values James now represented. The uniform James wore connected him not just to current military personnel but to all those who had served before him. "Sir," James said carefully, "would you allow me to help you reach the castle entrance? I can see that's where you were heading." Harold's eyes showed surprise and gratitude in equal measure. "I couldn't ask you to leave your post, lad. That wouldn't be right." "You're not asking, sir," James replied. "I'm offering. And, with respect, it would be an honor to help you complete your journey." The formality of James's language carried weight that went beyond mere politeness. This was one service member addressing another, offering assistance not out of pity or obligation but out of respect and recognition of shared values. Harold studied James's face for a long moment, perhaps seeing echoes of his own younger self in the guard's earnest expression. "In that case," he said finally, "I would be grateful for the help." James stood and extended his hand to Harold, providing the leverage the elderly man needed to regain his footing. Harold's grip was still strong despite his age, and James could feel the determination that had carried him through 30 years of military service. Once Harold was standing, James offered his arm for support. "Shall we proceed, sir?" The sight of a royal guard walking arm in arm with an elderly man created a stir among the tourists at Windsor Castle. Cameras clicked and phones emerged as people captured what they clearly recognized as an unusual and touching moment. Some visitors stepped aside respectfully, sensing the significance of what they were witnessing, while others seemed uncertain whether they should be documenting what appeared to be a break in protocol. James felt the weight of attention but remained focused on Harold. The elderly veteran moved slowly but with increasing confidence, his grip on James's arm providing the stability he needed to navigate the remaining distance to the castle entrance. With each step, James could feel Harold's determination, a quality that must have sustained him through decades of military service. "You know," Harold said as they walked, "I haven't been back here since I came with my wife Margaret 15 years ago. She passed 2 years back, and I've been meaning to return, but somehow never found the motivation until today." "What made today different?" James asked, matching his pace to Harold's careful steps. Harold was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Today marks 60 years since I first enlisted. Seemed like it ought to be marked somehow, you know? Margaret always made sure we remembered important dates, anniversaries and such. Without her, I've been letting too many things slip by unnoticed." James felt a deep sense of the moment's significance. This was not just an elderly man visiting a tourist attraction, this was a veteran marking 6 decades since he first committed himself to serving his country. The fact that Harold had chosen to make this pilgrimage alone, despite his physical limitations, spoke volumes about his character and dedication. 60 years, James repeated with genuine respect. "That's an incredible milestone, sir. Your service deserves to be honored." "Oh, I didn't serve the whole 60 years, Harold clarified with a slight chuckle. "Did my 30 and then retired to civilian life. But the anniversary of enlistment always felt more significant than the retirement date. That first day, when you put on the uniform for the first time and take the oath, that's when everything changes." James nodded understanding. His own enlistment day remained vivid in his memory, the mixture of pride, nervousness, and determination he had felt when first putting on his military uniform. He could only imagine how that moment must have felt for Harold in 1963, when military service carried different social expectations and Britain faced different challenges around the world. As they progressed toward the castle entrance, James noticed how other people were reacting to their approach. There was something in the expressions of the tourists that went beyond mere curiosity about a guard breaking protocol. Many seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something meaningful, a connection between generations of service that transcended the usual boundaries between performer and audience, guard and visitor. An elderly woman with a kind face approached them as they paused for Harold to rest. "Excuse me," she said to Harold, "but are you all right? Is there anything I can do to help?" "Very kind of you, miss," Harold replied with old-fashioned courtesy, "but this young man has everything well in hand." The woman smiled at James. "You're doing a wonderful thing, young man. My father served in the war, and he would have been so touched to see this kindness." James felt a flush of pride, not just in his own actions but in being part of a tradition that connected him to people like Harold and the woman's father. The uniform he wore represented more than ceremony, it symbolized a continuous line of service that stretched across generations. "Harold Thompson," the veteran said, extending his free hand to introduce himself to the woman. "Pleasure to meet you." "Mary Williams," she replied, shaking his hand warmly. "And the pleasure is entirely mine, Mr. Thompson. Thank you for your service." Harold's eyes brightened at the recognition. James realized that Harold probably did not receive acknowledgement of his military service very often in his daily life. Modern British society, while respectful of veterans, did not regularly provide opportunities for older servicemen to feel connected to their military identity. "Served in Ireland and a few other places," Harold said modestly. "Different times, but the same calling, I suppose." Mary nodded with understanding. "My father always said that the calling to serve never really leaves you, even years after retirement." James found himself thinking about his own grandfather again, wondering if William Mitchell had felt the same enduring connection to his military service. Had there been moments when his grandfather, like Harold, had sought out places and experiences that reconnected him with his military identity? As they resumed their journey, Harold seemed energized by the brief social interaction. "It's funny," he said to James, "how rarely people talk about military service in everyday conversation. You serve for decades, it shapes who you are, but then, in civilian life it becomes just one fact about your background. Days like today remind me how much that service meant, how much it still means." "I think I understand," James replied. "Even now, in active service, there's something different about being in uniform in public. People see you differently, and you feel that responsibility." Harold nodded vigorously. "Exactly right, lad. The uniform makes you a representative of something larger than yourself. Even decades later, I still feel that responsibility, though I haven't worn a uniform in years." They had almost reached the main castle entrance now. James could see his fellow guards maintaining their posts, and he wondered what they were thinking about his extended absence from duty. He hoped they understood the significance of what he was doing, but even if they questioned his judgment, he felt certain he was making the right choice. "Tell me about your training," Harold said, genuinely interested. "How does someone become a royal guard these days?" James described the selection process, the months of preparation, and the standards required for the role. Harold listened intently, occasionally nodding with recognition at aspects that reminded him of his own military training decades earlier. "The precision hasn't changed," Harold observed. "Military training has always been about attention to detail, following orders, and maintaining standards under pressure. The specific skills might evolve, but the fundamental requirements remain the same." "The mental side is what I found most challenging," James admitted. "Standing perfectly still for hours while people try to get reactions out of you, that takes a kind of discipline I never knew I had." Harold chuckled. "Different challenges in my day, but the mental toughness requirement was just the same. Whether you're standing guard at a palace or patrolling a dangerous neighborhood in Belfast, you need to be able to keep your composure and focus on the mission." As they reached the castle entrance, James felt a mixture of accomplishment and melancholy. He had successfully helped Harold complete his journey, but their time together was coming to an end. The connection he felt with this veteran had been unexpected and meaningful, a reminder of the human dimension that underlay all military service. Harold stopped at the entrance and took a long look at the castle walls, his expression showing deep emotion. James remained beside him, understanding that this moment held significance beyond what casual observers might recognize. "You know," Harold said after a few minutes of contemplation, "Margaret would have loved to see this. Not just the castle, but this moment, this kindness from a young man who understands what service means." James felt honored to be part of Harold's commemoration of his anniversary and his remembrance of his late wife. The simple act of walking together had become something more profound, a bridge between past and present service, between memory and ongoing tradition. "Sir," James said carefully, "would you like me to stay with you for a few more minutes? I want to make sure you're comfortable before I return to my post." Harold looked at the young guard with deep appreciation. "You've done more than enough already, son. But, if you could spare just a few more minutes, I'd appreciate the company." James nodded, understanding that Harold was not just requesting companionship but seeking to extend a connection that had proved meaningful to both of them. As James stood beside Harold at the castle entrance, both men seemed reluctant to end their encounter. The connection they had forged transcended their obvious differences in age, era of service, and military roles. They had found common ground in shared values of duty, honor, and service that created an immediate bond of understanding and respect. Harold gazed at the ancient stones of Windsor Castle with eyes that held 60 years of memories. "I've seen a lot of changes in my lifetime," he said thoughtfully, "but places like this remind you that some things endure. The crown, the tradition of service, the idea that some things are worth protecting and preserving." James nodded, feeling the weight of those words. His own service was part of that continuity Harold described. In a world where we often pass by strangers without a second glance, where the rush of daily life blinds us to the struggles of those around us, there exists moments that restore our faith in humanity. This is the story of two men from different walks of life, separated by generations but united by service, duty, and an unbreakable bond of respect. What happens when a young royal guard, trained in precision and protocol, encounters an elderly veteran whose body betrays the courage his heart still carries? What unfolds is not just an act of kindness, but a profound reminder that true strength lies not in our ability to stand alone, but in our willingness to help others stand tall. This is a story that will touch your heart, challenge your perspective, and remind you that sometimes the most powerful moments happen not in grand gestures, but in simple acts of human dignity. It's about recognition, respect, and the invisible threads that connect those who have dedicated their lives to serving others. Prepare yourself for a journey that reveals how one moment of compassion can change two lives forever, and how the greatest battles are sometimes fought not on distant battlefields, but in the quiet corners of our everyday world.